Back home again. This is the one program that I really was looking forward to, because this gentleman is the one that's in charge of VMI. And he's going to even give a little bit of his background. So I would like for us, the Hershey Civil War Roundtable, the general public or whatever, to give Keith and his wife, Pat, a nice, warm Hershey welcome.
Before I forget, because the work that you're doing is so important. Every time I have the chance to be with a roundtable around the country, I was with my own roundtable last night, and now I have the good fortune of being with you. The work you do through your interest, generating funds for battlefield preservation, tens of thousands of acres are now set aside for forever, because you get together with your interest and make that happen. So before I said anything more, I wanted to make sure to thank you for the work you've been doing up here for a good many years. As was mentioned, I spend all of my time down at the Virginia Military Institute. Well, most of my time. I'm Colonel Keith Gibson. I am the department head of our museum system. In fact, I can prove that because I have pictures of it. The VMI museum system, actually, it's a system because it consists of 3 different museums. The oldest museum in the Commonwealth of Virginia is located at VMI. The museum itself was established in 1845. Stonewall Jackson was a visitor to our museum during his tenure there at the Institute. That we'll mention later. We're today located in that building, Jackson Memorial Hall, as a memorial to Stonewall Jackson. Have any of you been there? Some of you have been there. A good number of you have been there. Great. I want to try to work out an arrangement where all of you can get there at some point in the future to move up the valley slightly further than maybe you've been in the past and come to Lexington. The Museum of the Civil War, Newmarket Battlefield State Historical Park, also falls under my office. In fact, 2 years ago, it's been 2 years since Lieutenant Colonel Troy Marshall was here to present a program to you, I think, on the history of why that place is important to VMI specifically. But it is the state museum, the official state museum there, located on Newmarket Battlefield, where a seminal moment in American collegiate history took place. Never before or since has a college student body taken place in pitched combat as its own unit, not brigaded with some other veteran organization, but as its own unit, and achieved victory on the battlefield. And this place, the Stonewall Jackson House, did anyone recognize that? You recognize that as Major Jackson's home. Major Jackson moved in here with his bride, Mariana. They purchased this house as upwardly mobile Victorians in the late months of 1858. That is the house as it was presented to them, as it welcomed them. But the house itself has a much, much longer history. 218 years that house is set at number 8 East Washington Street in Lexington, Virginia, just across from the old courthouse building. The thing that fascinates me about history, and perhaps you as well, me as a professional public historian, it's the American Civil War as an example. April 1861, April 1865, those are kind of the dates, at beginning and end. But the reality is the war was percolating in the American fabric decades, generations early. And indeed, the war's long shadows continue on. It's that way with every element of history. We are the continuation of that experience that draws us together to explore battlefields. We are part of that fabric. So is this house. For 218 years, the Jacksons would be resident there, and the reason it has been preserved for a relatively short period of that 218 years. The house itself has had a complex and sometimes a challenging history. And that's what I want to share with you about that place. Something you might not have heard when you take the tour of the facility. In 1800, a guy named Cornelius Dorman, he was the jailer in Lexington. He was known quite well by the community. He comes across the street from where his jail was located at the courthouse, and he buys a little plot of land and builds a very small I-frame house, a 2-over-2 house, a humble building that he planned to move his family into. The city would provide him a different residence very shortly, and he starts to rent this place out. It was a pretty good investment property, as it turns out. By 1845, he sells it to a local up-and-coming doctor, Archibald Graham. Archibald Graham is not only building his profession, he's building his family, and he needs more space. So on the back of that brick structure facing Washington Street, he builds an addition, a stone addition to the rear, doubles the size of the house. He puts a special front door on. He changes the partitioning inside a bit and puts a special front door on just so his patients can come in and have their examinations and not bother the children running around through the rest of the house. It's serving as something of a medical facility for the local community, 1845 to 1858, at which time, and by the way, in this picture here, you can see the back of that stone part of the structure, the back porch of Dr. Archibald Graham's house. And there's the courthouse, and the jail was right over there. That made its proximity convenient. 1851, the city of Lexington is going to involve itself in a great improvement project. Hilly. Lexington is a very hilly part of Virginia. And they lower the streets in certain places by as much as 6 feet and raise them in other places by as much as 6 feet to level things out. And it just so happens in front of Dr. Graham's house, they lowered the street 6 feet, which resulted in their front door right there being 6 feet above the sidewalk. So this entryway and steps had to be added to the house at that time. And that will be pretty much what was on the market when Major and Mrs. Jackson were in the real estate acquisition business. Jackson and the Jacksons move into this house in January of 1859, and Jackson could not have been happier. Jackson was an orphan by the age of 7, a story I'm sure you know. The thing that he had wanted to get out of life was evading him, a family. He had never known a family. And now it was his chance to create one with his new wife. Their children would be raised in this house, he anticipated. And he goes to work improving this place. He puts on a new roof, a new tin roof right away, and makes other improvements. Now, his neighbors, the community is growing. The Davidson sisters are going to build a house very similar to his right next door, and they begin to add improvements and additions onto their property pretty soon. Tom Jackson's never going to change the footprint of his house. In fact, it was a lot of house for 2 people. Mariana complains that this was the wrong house for us. It's way too big for 2 people. It's not in a particularly good part of town. And she had a different version of maybe what we might watch one of those TV shows on the Home and Garden channel or whatever that is. My wife is watching constantly, where you're imagining your perfect dream house. Well, there is a sketch in Mariana's hand of her perfect dream house. It would be of the latest fashion, a 2-story maybe with a side addition, but of the Italianate style that was raging around the country in the late mid-1850s. She literally writes this on the back of the proverbial envelope. We have the original in our collection still today. So Mariana, not quite as in love with the prop place as Tom would prove to be. But notice, the Jacksons would own this house for 50, well, when you do the math, you say it's not 50 years, but it's almost 50 years, a half a century. Tom Jackson's not going to live a half a century, as you well know, beyond the Civil War. But Mariana does. She lives up into the 20th century. The Jacksons would be content, upwardly mobile Victorians here, investing in the local community, pursuing his career as a college professor, teaching artillery tactics to the young cadets at VMI for a decade. In fact, the men that would ultimately become the backbone of the Army of Northern Virginia Artillery Corps under General Pendleton, serving throughout the state, throughout the South. In the parlor of that house, it's a Sunday morning. The Jacksons would normally be preparing to walk the 2.5 blocks down to the Presbyterian church, where they always were on Sunday mornings. Jackson teaching a Sunday school class in the afternoon for African Americans in the community. This particular Sunday would be different. It's not a typical Sunday. It's April the 21st, 1861. Jackson has received orders to take the Cadet Corps to Richmond to serve as drill masters for the Army, for recruits like these young gentlemen who would be pouring into Richmond. I want to be a Confederate soldier. Well, somebody had to teach them how to do that. It would be the VMI Cadet Corps, and Major Thomas Jackson would take them to Richmond to learn that craft. The first commands that Jackson gave during the American Civil War was on the morning of April the 21st, 1861, when he took command of the cadets by the right flank forward march. And off they went. Jackson is not going to return to this house. He never returns to Lexington in life again. Before he leaves that house, he and Mariana go into the parlor and they kneel and they pray about the future that they expected in their home and the future that was becoming a reality for them in their lives on that Sunday morning. Mariana is going to be leaving the house too, as it turns out. She goes down to be with her family. The war's not going to last very long. It's an opportunity to reacquaint with all of our cousins down in Davidson and Charlotte, North Carolina. She'll never return to the house either, as it turns out. Not that she dies, but it's no point going back to that house with its sad memories after the war. In fact, she doesn't return to the house, but she can't let it go either. It's her connection with Tom and the garden and all of those things, the aspirations that they had envisioned, the family that they would raise in that house. It was embodied in that brick and stone structure, but she never returns to it. She rents it out to a series of tenants over the next several decades, almost 50 years, way beyond the time that she should have kept it for her own interest. This is a photograph of it showing the depreciated structure about 1890. That's from a postcard. The postcard says, "Home of General Jackson, Lexington, Virginia." The thing that fascinates me about that postcard, that even in that disheveled, dilapidated version, it was still revered, a shrine, if you will, as the home of Stonewall Jackson. Mrs. Jackson, about 1904, contacts the local chapter of the United Daughters of Confederacy, the Mary Custis Lee chapter, to be exact, and suggests to them they might want to buy this house from her to turn into a widow's home for the local community. The UDC chapter said, we have a bigger need even than that here in the community. We don't have a hospital. So the UDC would buy this house in 1906 from Mrs. Jackson and turn it into the first general hospital for the community of Lexington and Rockbridge County. Doing so meant many additions would be added to that structure. Remember, there's Tom's house. That's Tom and Mariana's house there. And now all of these elements have been added. The Davidson sisters' house, it's been connected with a bridge connector here. Pilasters and a pylon impediment has been added to the structures to give them a more sophisticated public facility look as opposed to a private home look in this era that the Jackson's humble house becomes a hospital for the community. It had already sort of had a little flavor of that back in Archibald Graham's time when he lived there in the 1840s. And that will be the facade that faced 8 East Washington Street during its time, its 50 years as the local general hospital. The only thing that you could identify as being Jackson's house is the roof line up there and the chimneys. These ladies are located in that sun porch on the side where that picture was taken. But this community would serve, the hospital would serve the black and the white community of Lexington through World War I, through World War II, through epidemics. This is a photograph of the extensions that were added to the back to accommodate the growing needs of the community. And in 1954, the community finally created a purpose-built hospital just on the edge of town, on about 12 acres of land where they could expand as much as the community needed. It's still there today, the Stonewall Jackson Carilion Hospital, as it's known today. So this house, the hospital, is vacated on Washington Street. And this is what it looked like if you would have visited between 1954 and the mid-1970s. This is the house that you would have visited as Stonewall Jackson's house, but it doesn't look anything like the house in which Stonewall Jackson, it's only the location. But somewhere hidden back behind all of this stuff, the house was waiting to be revealed again. But not yet. The house, during the period of 1954 to 1976, a period in which it's owned a guy named J. Johns, a blind attorney, as it turns out, but a lover of history, an admirer of Jackson, purchased the house with the intention of creating a shrine to his favorite hero of the past, Stonewall Jackson. And no buildings, no structures were removed. That footprint remained the same. But in the front rooms of the original portion of the house, this section, they set up a couple of period rooms to sort of get the flavor of what it might have been like when Tom and Mariana and the 6 slaves that lived there with them, when they were in residence, late 1850s. This is a photograph of one of those rooms. The way you knew what belonged to Stonewall and Mariana, it had little red tapes on it. So whenever you see a red tape, you knew that that was a Jackson artifact. I doubt if Jackson had a portrait of himself hanging in his dining room, but J. Johns put one there, just so you wouldn't forget whose house it was. But in the mid-1970s, an organization called the Historical Lexington Foundation acquired the property with the intention of turning back time, turning it back to when that little upward mobile Victorian family took residence there with their aspirations in 1858. A forensic architectural study, exhaustive, was done on the property to determine what was original, what had been added. And the house began to reveal itself and tell those researchers what it wanted to be. But its journey was not yet complete. So as this process took place, all of those additions began to be peeled back, layer after layer, until they revealed the core of the building that Tom had acquired for $3,000, by the way, in 1958. It stretched him economically. It was all he could do to pay that mortgage from buying that property. But now with the core of the house, the original house revealed, the internal work could begin to recreate the spaces in which that family spent those last months before Civil War would break them apart. Just a few months before the house was ready to be opened to the public again, as Tom and Mariana's house, disaster struck. A fire broke out on one January night in 1979, and it threatened to destroy the entire property. Fortunately, the fire department acted quickly, and very little damage in a relative sense was done, and it could be restored. So by October of that year of 1979, the local paper proudly announced that the house would open once again that fall. Mrs. Jackson was, well, I should say, Tom and Mariana's granddaughter was at that event. She was about 95 years old at that point. She will live for another 10 or 12 years, as it turned out. I, too, was at that event in 1975 to witness the reopening of Tom and Mariana's house. Today, when you visit the house, you'll see rooms interpreted with Jackson's own furnishings and period furnishings, recreating the lifestyle that they wish to establish for themselves. And I need to tell you that every summer they were together. They didn't spend the summer at Natural Bridge, one of our favorite attractions in Rockbridge County. They would go to Niagara Falls, or they would take the Springs in Sarasota, or they would go to Manhattan or Philadelphia. Philadelphia was their favorite place to go furniture shopping for their new house. And so it is that local stuff just wouldn't do. They wanted to find stuff from Philadelphia that they had shipped back to them in their house at 8 East Washington Street. Imagine the conversations that are taking place in those rooms in 1860. War clouds are gathering. We're not sure what the future might hold. Jackson insisted up to the last moment that he was a strong Unionist. He saw no reason for the nation to tear itself apart. But when orders came and Virginia left the Union on the 17th of April, 1861, his destiny became clear. So the story the house tells today is of an American family, not unlike us, struggling on day-to-day issues and dealing with the pressing concerns of the time that would not only lead the nation to be torn apart, but this small little family. The Jacksons, the children that they planned to raise in that house, there would be one child, a daughter, that would live to adulthood. Jackson had the good fortune of holding that precious child just weeks before he would be accidentally and mortally wounded at Chancellorsville. That daughter will grow up, and she has a daughter. But Tom and Mariana's daughter, by age 28, is dead. So that granddaughter gets raised by her grandmother. So there's a very close, intimate connection between those generations. And it would be that granddaughter that presided over the rededication of her grandparents' house in 1879. The house, once again, is alive with the spirit of the family that moved into there so with great expectations in 1859. A family who could not anticipate or predict the future as we know it. But now we can appreciate the past through the experience of that house. 218 years that house is set there, welcoming families, births, deaths, aiding the community as a hospital, and now aiding the community, and by the way, you're the community, aiding the community to understand how we got to where we are today. Now when Jackson left BMI, he mounts a horse. Officers usually get to ride horses. The enlisted men are going to be marching to Richmond. And quite often you see the great Stonewall Jackson being depicted on a horse, and he's of course most closely associated with the horse Little Sorrel that maybe some of you have seen. His hide is mounted in the VMI Museum. That is not Little Sorrel. That is called artist license. And Little Sorrel, I don't think, ever looked that good in life or death. But I want to tell you about that little horse, and really the three lives that that horse has led. The life that brings him to prominence, internationally really. Journalists were writing about Little Sorrel as they wrote about Jackson in the papers in Paris and Germany and England, not to mention New York and Boston. Jackson's first command, after he takes the cadets to Richmond, he's assigned to go off to Harper's Ferry, where you're going to be going in the spring. In fact, he was there about the same time of year. Harper's Ferry, pivotal point, critical strategic point for Virginia. The Baltimore-Ohio Railroad runs east and west through that area. Now, Little Sorrel, we are not sure where he was born. Some say he was born up in Connecticut, but somehow he got out to a farm in Ohio because we do know that in the spring of 1861, he is on a eastbound Baltimore and Ohio train, which will be intersected by welcoming Confederate troops. The horses that were on that train, including the horse that's going to become known as Little Sorrel, were destined for the Union Army, for the cavalry of the Union Army, which, as you remember, in the early war wasn't quite, well, there was a lot of work to be done for those guys. And Little Sorrel was going to be a part of that. He was going to be a part of the Union Army, not realizing that Jackson and his quartermaster commander Harmon had different plans. They took all those horses, and Jackson goes down to pick out a couple for himself. And the relationship that developed almost instantly between master and animal was palatable. People commented on it at the time. Just an animal you want to hug, that Little Sorrel horse. Well, Jackson said, this is a wonderful gift for Marianne. She'll so love having this horse back down in North Carolina until I get home and we can take him up to Lexington. As it turns out, as most generals, it's not the only horse that Jackson had. He had several. Competing for top horse in the Jackson stable was Big Sorrel, to be distinguished from the Little Sorrel. Jackson, yeah, there was a competent horse. He could be ridden in battle. Trojan horse, which turned out to be an appropriate name. It was a gift of admirers, which got returned pretty soon because it wasn't a horse for a battlefield. Molly, sort of a similar story there. A beautiful horse, but apparently, but not quite cut out for the confusion and the noise of the battle. And Superior, Jackson tried to perfect his horsemanship enough to use Superior on a number of occasions. Superior was a bay stallion, probably more horse than Jackson would have been comfortable with. When there was serious work on the battlefield to be done, you wanted a stable platform from which to give those orders. And Little Sorrel would prove to be that mount. Whenever Jackson knew he was going into battle, he would call for Little Sorrel to be brought up. So Mariana never gets her present. Jackson keeps Little Sorrel for himself. I've been fascinated by the relationship of these two horses and those two men. Truly, Little Sorrel is to Jackson as Traveler is to Lee. Traveler from Greenbrier County, we know his entire pedigree for several generations, just as we know Lee's. They were both FFVs, First Families of Virginia. They were meant for each other. And the same kind of chemistry took place. The first time Lee saw the horse that would become Traveler, he was just struck with that horse and wanted to acquire it for his own. Little Sorrel, on the other hand, was something of an orphan himself. Not even sure where he was born. He only knows that he was on a train and somebody came and took possession of him. Just like Jackson. Not First Families of Virginia. Struggling to make their way in the world. Scruffy looking, in fact. Yet, there they are. The regal and, well, they're not so regal. But this pair would find themselves together in all of these places over the next couple of years. One notable occasion was on June the 8th. It's a Sunday. Jackson, it's amazing. I'm sure you've probably noticed this. How often is it that Jackson is going to fight a battle on a Sunday morning? So it would be in Port Republic, just outside of Harrisonburg, Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley on June the 8th. Jackson, in fact, it's a beautiful day. It had been raining for weeks, and now one sunny Sunday morning, Jackson is telling Reverend Lacey to go get the troops ready for church service. And then all of a sudden, a Confederate private races panicked into Jackson's camp and says, there's Yankees in port, meaning in town, in Port Republic. Jackson, I think for the first time it occurred to himself, gee, I'm here at my headquarters, my army is on the other side of a rain-swollen river about a mile away. Maybe I better go join them if there's Yankees so close by. So Jackson tells this young private, if there are Yankees in port, you need to go back and fight them. So this private wheels around and dashes off back into town. And Jackson, what does he do? He says, bring me Little Sorrel. And Jackson mounts Little Sorrel, and those spindly little legs of that horse dashes down Main Street of Port Republic as fast as they could go. And Jackson's staff is, well, they tried to keep up with him, but they're being captured. The Union cavalry guys that were already literally in town were just picking them off one after another. Yet Jackson and Little Sorrel magically, and maybe without explanation, managed to get through all of that and back safely across the other side of a river, across a covered bridge. Maybe some of you have stood there. The explanation is that's how Jackson was dressed. He's dressed in his old VMI officer's uniform, a blue United States Army uniform. Well, those guys from Ohio, they're also dressed in a similar uniform. They're looking for the guys in the gray uniforms. So then they see Jackson and Little Sorrel. They don't really recognize him, but he's wearing a blue uniform. He must be one of us. And he passes right through to safety to the other side of the river. So Jackson gets over there. He wheels Little Sorrel around over the bridge that they had just come across, and he sees a piece of artillery down there. And there's guys fumbling around with the artillery. There's a guy here that fumbles around with artillery on occasion, and they were talking. But so these guys are getting their gun ready, and Jackson, sitting on top, Little Sorrel says, "Bring that gun over here," and nothing happens. Jackson's not, he's used to when he gives an order that something happens, nothing happens. So Jackson stands up in his always overly adjusted stirrups, stands up over Little Sorrel and says, "Bring that gun up here." And about that time, the gun fires, and the cannonball lands at Little Sorrel's feet and splatters them both with mud. At that point, Jackson realized, gee, maybe that's not our cannon, which was true. So he turns to the Rockbridge artillery and says, "Let them have it." And they began to return fire across the river. Close call, harrowing morning for Jackson and Little Sorrel. On it's arguably the most successful day in Jackson's military career of successful days is on May the 2nd, 1863. Jackson has just completed a 12-mile flank march around the Union Army. He's left Lee and Lee's section of the Army in front of the Union position, and he's circumvented the Union Army. He pops out of the wilderness, literally, out of the wilderness into a field where he rolls up the right flank of the Union Corps there, the 12th Corps. At the end of the day, Jackson and his staff go out in front of their lines to reconnoiter for the continuance of the battle on the following day. Jackson's men are returning to the line. The sun is going down. It's about 9 p.m. They are coming into the line at the position of a North Carolina brigade. In fact, the brigade's being commanded by one of Jackson's former students, a guy named James Lane. And right in the section being held by the 18th North Carolina, those fellows, fatigued, exhausted, edgy, see horses in the darkness coming towards them. They fire on that supposed enemy, and several of Jackson's staff fall out of the saddle dead. Keith Boswell, of note, topographic engineer. Jackson himself is wounded 3 times. Little Sorrel is wounded in that barrage of fire. Jackson receives a wound in his wrist, in his right wrist, in his left forearm, in his left shoulder. And Little Sorrel, for the only time on record that we know, panics and races off the Orange Turnpike into the brush, almost sweeping his master off out of the saddle. Jackson's men come to him realizing what had just occurred. They cut Jackson's raincoat that he was wearing off of him to see how much damage had been done. They put him on a litter and carry him to first a tent as a field hospital, and then on to a little place called Guinea Station. The amputation of the arm would take place that night, and everyone expected Jackson to live. It's better to lose a limb than to lose a life. Hunter McGuire, his surgeon, would have told you. Little Sorrel has wandered off into the wilderness. He's captured. He's discovered by Union troops who, when they realize who they have captured, in an honorable way, return him to Jackson and to Mrs. Stonewall Jackson. She will be a widow very soon. She's with Jackson. It's a Sunday again. It's a Sunday, a prominent day in Jackson's life of eventful times. Jackson is told by Mariana that this will be the day he greets his Lord. And he says, this is great. I always wanted to die on a Sunday. And so he gets that last wish. And he departs us. Little Sorrel, meanwhile, is still in the Union camp. And when word comes that Jackson's died, this is no longer a trophy. This is a sacred item, and it's returned to the widow. A new life in the post-war era. All of Jackson's belongings were sent down to his widow, who was with her family at Cottage Home, just outside of where Davidson College is located today. Her father had been the president of Davidson College. And Little Sorrel goes down there. Boy, he's had an adventurous life. He's ridden on trains. He's been in war. And now he's being put on a farm like some sort of plow horse. He has no interest in that. And he turns out that he's not earning his fee. And he becomes somewhat of a nuisance. He's letting the other animals out of their stalls by opening the gates. And Mariana's trying, but what am I going to do with this horse that is, it's become an awkward situation? So her solution is that she will send him back up to the Institute where the cadets can take care of him at VMI. Perfect solution. Here's one of his handlers. That's not a cadet. That's a now unknown individual taking Little Sorrel on the VMI parade ground. There's the barracks in the background. This seemed like a perfect connection. Well, someone convinced Mrs. Jackson, the widow Jackson, that she should get that horse back because money can be made. People will pay to see that horse. And we will travel him all through the South, all the way down to New Orleans and back. Well, they start that journey. And people are paying to see Little Sorrel. But news journalists and editorials are being written saying, what a horrible thing to do. That horse has already paid its dues. This is just inappropriate to treat the great Stonewall Jackson's Civil War horse in this manner. So, somewhat embarrassingly, the great money-making journey, the crass capitalism, is brought to a halt. And Mrs. Jackson says, General Smith, he's the superintendent of EMI. General Smith, I'd like to return Little Sorrel to you now. And General Smith, literally, this is very interesting, he's a very calm Episcopalian sort of guy. And he held Bible reading classes, Bible study in his home. And he gets really angry about this. And he says, I'm not going to touch that horse with a 10-foot pole. You're going to have to find something else to do with him. So, he can't come back to Lexington. But he goes, maybe appropriately, to the old soldiers' home in Richmond, where he can be there with men to take care of him that share that experience. The same battlefields. They both, veterans of those same events. The old soldiers' home, located on Boulevard in Richmond, is where several of the museums are located today. And a couple of the buildings from their time are still there. It was about a 20-acre complex. Old Sorrel, Stonewall Jackson's warhorse, died in the Confederate soldiers' home near Richmond, 6 o'clock Monday, age 32. It's estimated, but he was well into his 30s, a very handsome age for a horse. Now in the hands of a skillful taxidermist, and when his work shall be completed, he will be lifelike and will be returned to the soldiers' home. As long as there would be soldiers there, Little Sorrel would be with them. Frederick Webster was the hands of that capable taxidermist. Frederick Webster is not a person that we know of today, very many of us, but he had revolutionized the world of taxidermy. He had created a new technique that would allow mounted hides, particularly large animals, to be photographically reproduced. The sinew, the muscled construction could all be recreated under the hides, thanks to the techniques just invented by Frederick Webster. He's working at the Smithsonian. He has been brought to Richmond. It's clear that Little Sorrel doesn't have much time. So they bring Frederick Webster down to be there, to start the process as soon as it is necessary. In fact, Webster is taking measurements while Little Sorrel is still alive, taking measurements from the horse to get it just right. Here's Webster in his studio, and you can see one of his horse mounts in the back. No, that's a camel. To give you some idea of the process, the horse isn't stuffed. I've looked inside of him. It's hollow. There's nothing in there. The horse, but this is the process. First, the hide is removed and tanned like you would any hide that you were preserving, and an armature, a statue in essence of the animal is created from those measurements you hopefully took from life, and you begin to build that up from wood and metal, and then you put a sisal over that to give it a texture such as fat and muscle. You use plaster of Paris to create the finer points of the exact musculature of the legs, for example. And then, when all of that is completed, you have something that kind of looks like the animal that you want to end up with. You take the hide and you drape it back over this and stitch it all together, and you end up with something like that. That is not Little Sorrel, that's Comanche, actually. I'll come back to, anybody know who Comanche is? Yeah, very famous. Yeah, Custer, very, we'll get back to him in a second. Standing in the studios of Frederick Ed Webster, the taxidermist of Old Sorrel, the war horse of Stonewall, the stuffed figure of the famous animals placed in the attitude of attention, heads and ears erect. Old Sorrel, the most eventful in history, will be returned to the old soldier's home, and so he was. And he would spend as many years there as there were old soldiers to come and reminisce with him. At late nights, maybe when insomnia was keeping them awake, they could go visit Little Sorrel there in his glass case on the old soldier's home. But eventually, they too would fade away. And the old soldier's home would be closed. Little Sorrel, the orphan, is again homeless. In 1949, when the old soldier's home closes, a request is made, can Little Sorrel now come back to Lexington? And the answer is yes. Bring him back to Lexington, where he would be placed in the library, which was the location of the museum in those days, right after World War II. And there he is, down in the library building. The janitor of that building used to be very proud and loved telling visitors that he was the only person whose job responsibilities included watering a dead horse. Because the humidity that was required. That saddle was given to Jackson by British admirers during the war. We have that yet in the collection today. By 1971, Little Sorrel was in need of a facelift, and this Smithsonian taxidermist, Frank Greenwell, was asked to come down and do some patch-up repair work to Little Sorrel. Twice in the 70s, resulting in the animal that you might have visited if you came during that time period. In 2004, we had the opportunity to greatly expand the VMI Museum in Jackson Memorial Hall. It required, however, that we move everything out of the building, the entire 30,000-piece collection, including one of our most important pieces. So we carefully packaged Little Sorrel for, hopefully, his final journey. Carefully put him in this protective harness that you see there, and we rolled him successfully right to the door and realized he was too tall to go through the door. So, what to do? My background, by the way, I'm a VMI graduate. I took my undergraduate degree in civil engineering. So we're going to figure this out. So the solution ended up being, well, we couldn't ask the horse to bow his head, and so he's a little stiff these days. So we had to pick the rear end up, tilting the head down, scoot him under, and get through the threshold in that manner. Successfully, without breaking off any of the delicate tips of his ears. That was the real concern. And here he is being carted down, getting ready to be placed on this flatbed vehicle. You can see the construction is already underway for the expansion of the museum. Little Sorrel would make that final journey down the Old Valley Pike, Route 11, complete this time, though, with police escort, photographers along the sideways. Little Sorrel looking out over the parade ground, not unlike that earlier picture that you saw from 1883 of him standing there. That same building waiting for his return across the parade ground there. Now, we wanted to restore Little Sorrel in 2006, we were ready to move back into the facility. So we again had the Smithsonian taxidermy team from the National Natural History Museum at the Smithsonian to come down, and they gave me a detailed breakout of exactly all the work that they were going to accomplish. And the very first step was that we're going to take him outside and shampoo him. And I just envisioned all of that hair just disappearing down and floating away in the river, and we'd have a bald horse to show them and so forth, and somebody else would be directing the museum from that point. And I said, well, tell me more about this. They go, no, we do this all the time. Our elephants, our zebras, we do this all the time. I said, it'll be fine. And they explained to me that one of the secret ingredients was in those green bottles right there that they would shampoo him with. It's called Pert shampoo. They went down to this. And we paid big money for this. They probably some given by Civil War Roundtable. They went down to the local Walmart and bought 2 boxes, 2 crates of this stuff, and gave him a good going over there. It's his first bath in 150 years. It's almost like being there, isn't it? This work actually took about 3.5 months. They could do so much work, and then they have to leave and let that cure and dry, and then come back and do more work. And finally, to have the mount that we have today, a fresh, refreshing Little Sorrel. There you see with Jackson's saddle, waiting to tell his story as a participant, a spectator, a veteran of those events that we all know so well. Now, I might mention that Little Sorrel's skeleton is not inside of him. That was removed by Frederick Webster, and Frederick Webster kept it as part of his payment for doing this work. He has it at the Carnegie Mellon Institute up in somewhere in Pennsylvania. I don't know where that is. Anybody know where that is? Oh, of course, in Pittsburgh. Well, it's up there in Pittsburgh, up here in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania. So finally, they have no longer service for it. By 1929, it too comes back to VMI, but we can't get it back inside the horse. So instead, he goes down to the biology building where he is serving science. Cadets are able to examine an articulated skeleton of a large mammal who just happens to be Little Sorrel, Stonewall Jackson's horse. By the 1990s, Bud Robertson's epic biography of Jackson had come out, and Bud and I were talking one day, and he says, Keith, you know, it's just we need to bury that horse. It's just not right. It's not right. And I'm thinking, we're not going to bury our most important artifact in the museum. But I have a compromise. We have his bones in the back room. Maybe we could bury the bones. Would that satisfy? And on July the 20th, 1997, one of the hottest Julys on record, I'm sure, over 500 of Little Sorrel's closest friends came to witness the burial of this old veteran on the VMI parade ground, literally in the shadow of Jackson's statue there on the parade ground. Now, one thing that happened, the UDC was very much a part of this event. And they, unbeknownst to me, had told all of their members who were coming from all over the Commonwealth of Virginia and Maryland and Pennsylvania to gather there on that hot day to grab a little land of the battlefield that's closest to you, where Jackson and Little Sorrel were, Manassas, Sharpsburg, Fredericksburg, Port Republic, Cross Keys, Kernstown, all of those places, and bring them to the burial ceremony. And near the end of that ceremony, and it was hot, I repeat again, I'm the master of ceremonies, if you will, for lack of a better term. In the sweltering heat, I told folks, if you would like to participate in this event, there's dirt down here. Select the dirt most meaningful to you in relation to Jackson, and help us bury this horse. And I figured like 3 people would do that, because the rest of them are going to be running for the shade at the culmination of this ceremony. Patiently and dutifully, almost all of those 500 people lined up, waiting for their opportunity to be a part of this history, to be a part of it, to participate in it. And so now the soil of all of those battlefields are intermingled with the soil of the VMI parade ground. So when the cadets are marching there every Friday afternoon at 4:35, and you can come and see them, they're marching literally on the ground of these battles. It was covered by newspapers around the country and foreign press. I know you're going to ask this question. I'll answer it now. So how many historically significant mounted horse hides are there in the world, you might ask? Well, there's only this many. There's less than a dozen, as it turns out. The earliest one, I was shocked to find, Sweden's King Gustavus Adolphus, who is sometimes noted as really the creator of modern day cavalry tactics, lost his mount during battle in 1632 and had him mounted. That horse has been standing like that since 1632. It makes Little Sorrel look like, you know, yesterday. And earlier examples, Peter the Great's horse, Letzel, 1832. Let me point out how awkward that mount looks. It's just not, is that really a horse? I'm not sure. Frederick Webster would do a lot to create them. Wexley, who gets mortally wounded in the Battle of Waterloo. He was the mount of William of Orange. Of course, one of Napoleon's horses here, the Vizier, 1826, has Napoleon's initials stamped on his rump there. What an honor that was. Winchester, also known as Renzi, Phil Sheridan's horse that he rode triumphantly from Winchester to Cedar Creek at that pivotal moment of that battle, rallying the troops and achieving victory, riding on that black horse, Winchester. He is now at the Smithsonian. In fact, Winchester and Little Sorrel are the only two mounted horses that you can go and visit today from the American Civil War. Over 3 million horses and mules died during that war. And Winchester and Little Sorrel were survivors. And of course, as we had already mentioned, Comanche, 1890, the only survivors we know, the only white survivor of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Custer's last stand. Custer had fought down in the Shenandoah Valley, and his demise was met with some relief, I would have to say, in 1876. Comanche was there. He moves back into his camp riddled with arrows penetrating his body. You know, a horse can take a lot more damage than a man can. I mentioned Little Sorrel was wounded several times throughout the war. He never really showed any marks of it. He could absorb that 58 caliber ball. Jackson couldn't. Comanche could absorb those slings and arrows and live a right life. Farlap, very famous racehorse in Australia. One of the, actually, I think the finest mounted horse really to be seen anywhere. That horse could step away and you wouldn't be surprised. It's so well done. And who could forget Misty and her foal Stormy? Does anyone, have you forgotten Misty? Did anyone remember Misty? Don't remember? Misty of Chickadee, the Walt Disney movie, and of course a story from the late 1940s about this young Chickadee pony, these wild ponies that still live on Assateague Island. In fact, my wife Pat and I were just there 2 weeks ago. We visited Misty. I took better pictures of her, but I didn't have a chance to get one in here. But there she is. I guess that looks like a pony. The taxidermy there might be lacking something. And of course, the trigger. But Little Sorrel is there with a very special place to remind us of then, and for us to reflect on now. A horse as a sentient being that participated, that witnessed all of these things that we go now today to glean understanding and meaning from. Maybe that horse can help us with that. And that's what I wanted to tell you about Jackson's home and Jackson's horse. Thank you.
took all the measurements, they took the skeleton out, and they did the taxidermy. Is any of the fur on Little Sorrel's real fur?
Oh, absolutely. At least 95% of it is his fur, his hide. One of the amazing things is that as techniques advance, they become, as time goes on, techniques become perfected. The work that the Smithsonian taxidermists did most recently in 2006, and it's about time to get them back, but when they cleaned off Little Sorrel's head, the fine little muzzle hair that every horse has is there. Little Sorrel's muzzle hair is still there. It looks like a man that didn't shave very well, you know, in the morning. But when he was undergoing this process, my wife Pat was there examining the horse. She's ridden horses all of her life. She's very interested in this. And the taxidermist said, "Smell." They were working on his hindquarters, shall I say, at that point. And they said, "Pat, come over here and smell this." And really, okay. And so she does, dutifully. And what she experienced was the smell that you would find if you walked up to your horse in a stall. That exact smell is what she experienced.
It still smells like a horse.
Still smells like a
His
horse.
lips were so soft and velvety. I mean, they're his
Now,
lips.
there is a photograph out there that made it into the AP wires of my wife sniffing this horse's tail. You can Google that. You can Google that. Wife sniffing horse's tail. And I don't know about that.
I do have it.
But almost 95% of what you see is Little Sorrel, is that hide. In fact, there are things called saddle markings that happen when horses are rubbed with the saddles, you know, that will affect sometimes the colorations of their hide. And I can identify photographs because people are constantly bringing, is this Little Sorrel? Is this Stonewall Jackson? He has a beard, it must be Stonewall Jackson. I can identify pictures real pictures of Little Sorrel based on the hide that we have today. Because those saddle marks, those saddle spots are exactly where they're supposed to be if the picture's accurate.
Back there in the back there. In the back.
Yes, sir.
What does sorrel mean, and why did Jackson choose that name? Is there a story behind that?
It's a color, the reddish color, and Little Sorrel was to distinguish him from another red horse that Jackson had that was bigger. Little Sorrel is only just slightly over 14 hands. Not big for a horse, big for a pony. But that was a distinguishing nomenclature. Bring me the Little Sorrel. Now, he was also known as Fancy, which was almost joking because the horse was anything but fancy. So that was sort of an inside joke to call him Fancy. But Little Sorrel, Fancy, those were names that folks of his time knew him by. Yes, sir.
I read an article where near the end of his life, down at BMI, they had him in a sling because his back legs were
You're absolutely right. I didn't go into that detail, but you're correct. Little Sorrel had gotten so feeble that in order to have him stand, he could not raise himself any longer. So the old soldiers created this hoist and a belt around his midsection to help him stand up and receive his visitors as they plucked hair out of his mane and out of his tail as souvenirs. One day, as they were going through this process, that belt slipped and Little Sorrel fell to the ground and fractured his back. And that's what precipitated his death. That's when they knew we need to get the taxidermist down here right away, and Frederick Webster arrives. If you look at Little Sorrel today, his head is erect and his head is back and his eyes are large, as it said in that newspaper clipping, as if he's in a position of attention. I think he's panicked. I think it's this taxidermist measuring him for something, like, what's going on here? You know, what do you intend? Yes, sir.
When I visited VMI, I can't remember exactly what year it was, but he was still on display behind a wooden fence.
Correct, yes, right.
And I stood up just a little riser. I stood up next to him and realized he's not that big a horse.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
I was wondering, how tall was Jackson? How far late was his legs?
Jackson was just under 6 feet, right around 5'11".
Okay. So you got my
Jackson
height.
Jackson weighed about 140 pounds. You know, we talk about people being smaller back then. People weren't as wide back then. People were narrower back then. But, you know, a pretty normal height. Jackson took care of that long-legged appearance by cinching up the stirrups quite a bit and keeping a lot of bend in his leg.
Yeah.
But you're right. Jackson would have been sort of awkward looking on that size horse.
I touched the horse. I don't know if that was
Uh-oh.
appropriate.
Well, I'll have to talk to you about that later. There's an extra charge for touching the horse.
My assessors were considered cattle.
Oh, well, that's okay. Yes, sir.
The piano that is located in the Jackson home, is that original?
It is. It is. It's one of the Jackson pieces. And we are very excited about a project that's just starting to have that piano restored so that we can literally play it when we have events in the house. We had the piano that belonged to Matthew Fontaine Maury. Some of you might recognize that name, the Pathfinder of the Seas. We have his Steinway piano that he purchased for his home when he was a professor at VMI. We had that restored, and we played that when we're having evening programs in the museum. So we'd like to have the same effect in the Jackson house. What a neat experience that would be to hear those sounds filling those rooms again. Yes, sir.
On your displays in the Jackson house, you also were showing the house across the street and all. Do you have that house also?
We do. That house is now administrative offices, and we are literally at this time we're building a new orientation center that will house ticketing, shop, sales area, and an orientation room. And we're moving all of that out of the historic house. If you visited the Jackson house before, you know you come in the back door and you're right there in the shop, and it's sort of tight. We're moving all of those service activities out of the historic property and into this new building that's being built on the back of the Davidson Tucker house that you're mentioning. So that will open up more period interpretive space in the Jackson's home. And part of the story that we will tell in that basement area is the story of those other Jacksons that lived there, the 6 other Jacksons, the African-American Jacksons, 2 of whom came to Jackson and asked him to purchase them and to arrange for them to then be able to buy their freedom from him eventually. We have made contact back with one of those families, by the way, that's still living down in North Carolina.
I would like to ask you a question to share with them. I want you to take a moment and tell them you consulted for a movie and the most famous actors that you've got to work with and so forth. At lunch, you could tell them it was really phenomenal. So I want you to just take a moment to share that.
Well, one of the things that, as a public historian, one of the things that I had the good fortune to do is be involved in the film industry for, my first film project was in 1985. And I have to tell you, that was the most exciting job that I ever had as a consultant, because I got to meet my childhood TV star heroes. Lloyd Bridges of Sea Hunt was in that movie. Hal Holbrook was in that movie. Alec Baldwin was in that movie. I had no idea who he was. He was a TV soap opera guy. I didn't know who he was. But there was another guy, Eddie Albert, was in that movie. And one time I was on, and I'm what, I don't know how old I am. I mean, I know how old I am, but then I wasn't 30 years old, and I'm standing there with Mr. Albert, and we're waiting for something to happen. We do that a lot, you know, on sets. And I began to make small talk. I said, Mr. Albert, do you remember being in a movie called Brother Rap with Ronald Reagan and Wayne Morris and Priscilla Lane? And he's going, Brother Rap? No, I don't think I ever was in a movie with that name. And I'm thinking, certainly he hasn't forgotten. And I go on to encourage his memory. You know, it was about some cadets at the Virginia Military Institute, and and he's saying, no, I was never in that movie, so now I'm really getting nervous. And I said, oh, well, sorry, sir, I thought that you were in it. So we stand there for like another 3 or 4, which seemed like me a half an hour, painful minutes of silence. And he says, of course I remember being in Brother Rat. That was my very first film. Blah, 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 blah. And he starts talking about it. That was interesting to me because it was about VMI. The movie came out in 1939, and he had been in the theater version as well as the film version, so I knew he couldn't have forgotten about it. But over the years, many other films, and we were talking about Gettysburg, Gods and Generals, and I was Stephen Lang's character coach for his role as Jackson. Bud Robertson was Robert Duvall's character coach for Lee, and I think both of those guys they really did a remarkable job capturing those individuals. When we did our little premiere of Gods and Generals at VMI, Jackson's closest living relative was going to be there. And Stephen says, you think I could sit beside her? Which he did. And made her day. She very much enjoyed that.
Okay, so first of all,